for us, here's where things get interesting. The gameplay of Skyward Sword seems to be the thing that makes or breaks the game for most people. And well, yeah, I get that. Perhaps more than any other Nintendo EAD developed game to this day, Skyward Sword has the biggest emphasis on motion controls to date. And, you know, it's sort of made it for us. Sort of.
Let's start by looking at the most publicized aspect of Skyward Sword's gameplay, the sword combat. Mimicking sword swings with your Wii Remote movements has been something that Nintendo's clearly wanted to do for a long time. And after a good 5 years of development, the result is actually less than what was touted. Whereas we were promised sword swing control that matched the angle of your swing 100%, this being known as one-to-one motion control, what was instead used was a swing system that incorporated a meager 8 directions available for slashing, plus a pierce attack. Now, we're pretty sure that this was done so that enemy weaknesses would be less confusing to exploit. However, if that's true, that decision resulted in a few issues with the final combat. One, the way most of these enemies hold their swords or telegraph their attacks is fucking ridiculous when compared to the proper scraps complete with dodging that you had with enemies such as Darknuts or Ganondorf in previous games. And two, since there are 8 directions, that means there's a point where one oddly angled swing might be interpreted as one direction or another close to it. To me, this was most notable during the final battle with Girahim, where I was so into the awesomeness of that battle that my piercing strikes were too fast and got registered as downward swings.
Even aside from that, the remote sometimes interprets mere directional adjustments as a full swing of your sword. It's surprisingly not the most intuitive thing in the world, and this swing detection really should have been less sensitive. Are the sword controls a failure though? Objectively, yes, they are. Though even despite that our TVs probably weren't very good, we were able to play the game just fine, despite the sensitivity of the sword. And indeed, the two of us and loads of other people rather enjoyed the sword play even for how ridiculous it could be. That said, most of the recent bile towards Skyward Sword cites these controls as their biggest problem. Whether or not those who took issue also had sensor problems is anyone's guess. The point is that people seem to be split down the middle about these controls, and so objectively speaking, they fail to satisfy thoroughly.
The same can be said to an even greater degree about the other many uses of motion control in Skyward Sword. This includes the swimming in later sections of the game which, though it works nicely, just really isn't necessary to have to be controlled by aiming with a remote. It really feels like a lot of these decisions, such as those loft wing sections, were made to show off the Wii Motion Plus, and it really adds nothing except for the potential for the remote to get frustratingly unfocused. Even with something like Metroid Prime Trilogy's gunplay, which mimicked your in-game movements, why it worked so well wasn't because of the motion control, but due to how precise and intuitive the mechanic was. The point is that the motion controls work mostly fine in Skyward Sword, but none of it was required to make a good game. Initially, there's this kind of awe at the technology and how mostly precise it is, but it overstays its welcome fast.
Especially when you factor in the dowsing mechanic, which, apart from being another motion gimmick, makes the game's path definitive and removes the sense of exploration and adventure that became such a beloved staple in the series. And when you already have Fi, an exposition fairy who chimes in and beats more than Navi for the most obvious and dumb as rock things, this game really shows that beyond its fancy controls, there's a lack of any true depth or intelligence in it, by deliberately insulting yours to make it seem like it's smart. People aren't idiots. We don't need to be constantly pressed with information because even in something like Donkey Kong 64, where there wasn't an exposition fairy, we knew we were in danger because the melon meter was mostly empty, and emptiness equals bad. With how commonly you see sirens meaning danger in fiction, one loud beeping thing to warn you that you're gonna die is fine. Leave it at that. Between this dowsing mechanic, your heart meter going down, and Fi chiming in to remind you that your meter is low, there is too much beeping, shut up, but I digress.
Let's talk about the level design. As we've touched upon earlier, there are 4 main areas, the mostly uneventful overworld, the Faron Woods, the Lanayru Desert, and the Eldin Volcano. When you first visit a new part of these areas, they turn out to be mostly long, linear extensions of the dungeons you have to go to, padding out the time until you actually reach the dungeon itself. Speaking of padding, you'll have to return to the same areas again and again, doing different tasks to obtain a different sacred doohickey. The worst examples of this are later in the game where you have to do an escort mission in the volcano area, as well as a stealth mission that happens right after the fire dragon has its stupid volcanic diarrhea. The stealth mission in particular is part of what has been lovingly named the padding of the hero, where you have to do this incredibly lengthy chain of plotless events just to reach your final dungeon. Beat the boss Bilosite to learn about the Song of the Hero, then revive the Thunder Dragon, complete the stealth mission and talk to the Fire Dragon, defeat the Imprisoned, grab these stupid note things and talk to the Water Dragon, play the song, complete another Silent Realm mission, and then finally you make it to the Sky Keep! Come on, game, there are some awesome things about you, but this is pushing it!
Now, let's talk about some of those awesome things about this game. For how much we've ranted about a lot of this game's mechanics, there are some really cool things to be found in Skyward Sword. For how much the volcano area sucks and the forest area is just decent, the desert region has some really inventive puzzles involving time, where these orbs send you back to an earlier time period where, say, there was a lake instead of quicksand. Aside from being a very clever use of a desert setting, these segments rely a lot on you being clever, carrying things through the different time periods while adapting to the changes in enemies and traps in the area. And the best part, there's minimal hand-holding! Point for intuitive game design! Some of the dungeons are even really impressive for a Zelda title. In particular, the standouts of the game are the Lanayru mining facility, which is full of time puzzles and challenging enemies, the Ancient Cistern, which combines Buddhist ideologies with water sections that actually, function, and the Sand Ship, because, holy shit, the world needed more robot skeleton pirates and fucking sniper rifle bows.
Another thing that I personally loved about the gameplay was how useful shields were during combat. I'll be fully honest, in other 3D Zeldas I barely ever used my shield against enemies. In Skyward Sword, I found using shield bashes were extremely useful. Not only are they an incredible defense given the greater emphasis on close-quarter swordplay, but it's a surprisingly good offensive tactic too. Successfully shield bashing something means you get to slash the crap out of the enemy for a while, plus you take no damage. Against an enemy with an electrical weapon, using the right shield even gives you an alternative method of attacking when using your sword means you'll be electrified. Speaking of which, there are multiple kinds of shields in this game, each with their own weaknesses and strengths, which adds an element of strategy to the mix of battling that I personally find a very welcome addition to the Zelda series.
And for as much as these sections are more blatant padding, the Silent Realm challenges are surprisingly some of the game's best moments. To complete these challenges, you need to pick up every goddess tier in the area, in order to obtain a treasure that will help you advance to the new part of the region. You don't get one in enough time or you spring a trap, these giant blade-wielding guardians awake and chase after you. While we already talked about how the surreal visuals and music make these parts really intense, the biggest thrill comes from the gameplay itself. You really do not want to get hit by these guys, because if you do, you die instantly, and you have to restart the trial. It's storytelling through gameplay at its absolute pants-shittingest.
Lastly, this game's boss fights are decent on average, though lacking in variety, with 3 fights with Girahim and 4 fights with the Demon King. Some of these boss fights are admittedly pretty bad, with the final Imprisoned fight having weak spots that are frustrating to hit, and with the fight with Tantalus basically amounting to standing far away and using Skyward Strikes, hitting its dumbass weak spot, and then slashing its hair snakes with no skill involved whatsoever. On the flip side, there's the fight with Koloktos, where you mutilate a giant statue with all the rage of a genocidal madman, and the final Girahim battle, which is an immersive sword duel featuring flashy finishers and a varied set of attacks. Unlike his master Demise, who instead of using his evil demon god powers, just decides to go Hulk Smash! Climactic.
At times, the gameplay of Skyward Sword feels like a microcosm of modern gaming. What with its focus on trying to draw in new crowds and using revolutionary new elements. Seriously, if the Wii's Wi-Fi wasn't totally shit, Skyward Sword would probably have DLC packs. That said, the controls, while very flawed, aren't anywhere near terrible. And while the padding and hand-holding are utterly ridiculous, there are some rather enjoyable moments of gameplay peppered in between, and even some new elements we'd like to see reused. But here's the ultimate question: is it all worth it? So yeah, we ripped into Skyward Sword for various reasons, and it's pretty obvious that we feel it's the weakest 3D Zelda game. That said, for all our deconstructions of the presentation, story, and gameplay, we actually enjoyed the game to a degree, especially when we played it for the first time. Looking at it more critically now though, its problems are a lot clearer to us, and I suppose we consider the game something of a guilty pleasure. But don't let us sway you because we feel it's a guilty pleasure. This is a very different game, so inevitably, you're going to react to it in ways unlike how we did.
Definitely try this game if you're a die-hard Zelda fan and you're able to accept the fact that it's a very structurally formulaic game in the series. You also might want to play it if you're interested in experimenting with motion controls and can mind its oversaturation in the gameplay. The sword play of Skyward Sword, though not the one-to-one motion we were promised, is still a unique feature and it demands to be tried, if even for testing purposes. You might want to consider avoiding this game if you're wary of the combat's sensitivity issues, or if what you wanted was a Zelda game that didn't follow the same structure. However, don't play this game if you're invested in good story writing, since its plot is highly reductive to the rest of the Zelda series, and the pacing of the game's plot events is abysmal and littered with pointless padding. Also skip on it if the heavy focus on motion controls sounds like it'll be bothersome for you.
This has been Rabbidluigi.
And this has been the Autarch.
And this concludes Zelda Month. Thank you for watching and take care.